In 1905, the people of Appalachia didn't warn you not to enter the woods. They warned you never to enter them alone. Men who walked the trails by themselves vanished between sunrise and dusk, leaving behind rifles stacked neatly against trees and footprints that simply stopped. Locals spoke in lowered voices of paths that shifted, of whispers that answered when no one was there, of something in the mountains that watched and waited for solitude. Those who returned were never the same, eyes hollow, stories unfinished, refusing to say what followed them out of the trees. This is the warning they carved into memory and passed down in fear. Go alone into the Appalachian woods, and you will regret it. The old woman's fingers trembled as she gripped my sleeve outside the general store in Hickory Falls, West Virginia. Her eyes, clouded with cataracts but somehow still piercing, searched my face with an intensity that made me want to pull away. "You heading up into them mountains?" she asked, her voice like dried leaves scraping across stone. I nodded, adjusting the heavy pack on my shoulders. It was late September of 1905, and I had traveled from Philadelphia to document the folk songs and stories of the Appalachian people for the university's new Department of Folklore. At 26, I fancied myself a modern man of science, armed with a new Edison wax cylinder recorder and notebooks bound in fine leather. "Yes, Mom. I'm a collector of—" "Don't matter what you're collecting," she interrupted, her grip tightening. "Never go alone into them woods, you hear me? Never alone." I smiled politely, the way one does when dealing with superstitious country folk. "I appreciate your concern, but I'll be perfectly fine. I have maps, supplies, and—" "Maps won't help you none when the mountains decide they don't want you to leave." She released my arm and stepped back, making a strange gesture with her hand that I later learned was meant to ward off evil. "The woods up there, they're old. Older than memory, and they don't take kindly to strangers, especially them that go wandering alone." "I'll keep that in mind," I said, tipping my hat and moving past her toward the trailhead. "You'll regret it," she called after me. "Mark my words, young man, you'll regret it something fierce." I didn't look back. I had heard similar warnings in every small town I'd passed through on my way into the mountains. The local people were full of ghost stories and superstitions, grist for my research, nothing more. In the rational light of the early 20th century, I had no patience for such nonsense. How wrong I was. How terribly, catastrophically wrong. The trail into the high country was steeper than I'd anticipated. The September sun filtered through the canopy of oak and hickory, casting everything in a golden green light that would have been beautiful if I hadn't been so focused on my footing. The path, if it could be called that, was little more than a suggestion winding between trees that seemed to grow closer together the higher I climbed. By midday, I had reached a small clearing where a creek burbled over smooth stones. I sat on a fallen log to eat some of the cornbread and salt pork I'd purchased in town, washing it down with cool water from the stream. The forest around me was alive with sound. The call of crows, the rustle of squirrels in the undergrowth, the distant drumming of a woodpecker. I was checking my map when I heard it for the first time. A whistle. Not a bird's whistle, but distinctly human. 3 short notes, then a long one. I looked up, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Perhaps another traveler, I thought, or a local hunter. I whistled back, The same pattern. Silence. Then from a completely different direction, the whistle came again. 3 short, 1 long. But this time it sounded wrong. The pitch was too perfect, too mechanical, as if someone were using a tin whistle rather than their lips. And there was an echo to it that the clearing shouldn't have produced. I stood, shouldering my pack. "Hello?" I called. "Is someone there?" The forest swallowed my words. Even the birds had gone quiet. After a long moment, I continued on my way, telling myself it was nothing. Mountain acoustics could play tricks on the ears. Everyone knew that. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was walking parallel to me, just out of sight among the trees. Every time I stopped to listen, the forest fell silent. Every time I continued, I heard the faintest rustle of movement, keeping pace with me. I told myself it was deer, or possibly a bear, though I prayed it wasn't. I walked faster. By the time I found a suitable place to make camp, a small hollow sheltered by a rock outcropping, the sun was already sinking behind the mountains, turning the sky a bruised purple. I gathered firewood quickly, grateful for the Boy Scout training I'd received years ago in Philadelphia. The familiar routine of making camp helped calm my nerves. As darkness fell, I sat close to my fire, its light pushing back against the wall of black that surrounded me on all sides. The mountains at night were a different world entirely. Without the moon, it was a new moon that week. The darkness was absolute beyond my small circle of firelight. I could have been in a cave for all I could see. I tried to eat, but I had little appetite. Instead, I focused on my notes, writing down my observations of the day, the landscape, the flora I'd identified. Scholarly work, rational work. It helped. Then the whistling started again. This time it was closer, and there were multiple whistlers all around my camp in a rough circle. They took turns creating a pattern, 3 short, 1 long, from the north, then from the east, then the south, then the west. Then they all whistled at once, a discordant chorus that made my skin crawl. Then silence. "Who's there?" I shouted into the darkness, hating the tremor in my voice. "Show yourselves," laughter answered me. Not the laughter of one person, but of many, echoing from the trees. It sounded like children, but there was something gleeful and cruel in it that made my blood run cold. It went on, rising and falling, until I wanted to clap my hands over my ears. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I sat rigid by my fire, my heart hammering, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my pencil. I added more wood to the fire, making it burn higher, brighter. I would not sleep tonight. I couldn't. The old woman's words came back to me. Never go alone into them woods. I was beginning to understand why. I must have dozed despite my intentions, because I woke with a start to find the fire burned down to embers and the sky beginning to lighten with false dawn. I was stiff and cold, every muscle aching from sitting up all night. But I was alive and unmolested. In the growing light, I examined my camp. Nothing had been disturbed. My pack sat where I'd left it, my supplies untouched. There were no footprints in the soft earth around my fire except my own. Perhaps I had imagined it all, I told myself. Exhaustion, unfamiliar surroundings, the power of suggestion from the old woman's warning. These could all conspire to make a man hear things that weren't there. I made a cold breakfast, not wanting to take the time to rebuild my fire, and consulted my map. According to my calculations, I should reach the settlement of Cooper's Hollow by early afternoon. There was supposed to be a small community there, mountain people who had lived in these hills for generations. They would have songs and stories for me to collect. I would do my work, then I would leave these mountains and never return. The trail that morning was confusing. Several times I found myself at forks that weren't marked on my map, or the path would seem to double back on itself in ways that made no sense. My compass behaved strangely, the needle spinning lazily instead of pointing true north. I told myself it was iron deposits in the rocks, a natural phenomenon, but I was lost. I could admit that much. The sun, when I could see it through the canopy, was high overhead, which meant it should be near noon, but I had no idea how far I'd traveled or in which direction. The trees all looked the same. Massive oaks and chestnuts, their trunks wider than a man could wrap his arms around, pressing close on all sides. That's when I found the tree with the carvings. It stood in a small clearing, a massive oak that must have been centuries old. Its bark was covered in symbols, not words, but strange geometric shapes and spirals that seemed to writhe and shift when I looked at them directly. They had been carved deep into the wood, and from the weathering, they were old, very old. At the base of the tree, someone had left offerings. I knelt to examine them, coins blackened with age, small carved wooden figures, bundles of dried herbs tied with thread, and something that made my stomach turn, small bones arranged in careful patterns. I stood up quickly, backing away from the tree. This was some kind of shrine, I realized, but to what? Or to whom? That's when I noticed the silence. Again the forest had gone completely quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. The whistling started again, but this time it was different. It was closer, and it was coming from directly behind me. I spun around. There was a man standing at the edge of the clearing. At least, I thought it was the man at first. He was tall and thin, dressed in clothes that might have been fashionable 50 years ago, a long black coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He stood perfectly still, not breathing that I could see, not moving at all. "Hello?" I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm a bit lost. Can you direct me to Cooper's Hollow?" The figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, impossibly still. I took a step backward. "I'm sorry if I've trespassed. I didn't mean to disturb." The figure tilted its head to one side, too far, at an angle that would have broken a human neck, and I realized, with dawning horror, that I couldn't see a face under that hat. Not because of shadow, but because there was nothing there. Just a smooth, blank space where a face should be. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes and face, my back bouncing painfully against my back. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from that clearing, from that thing that wasn't a man. Behind me, I could hear it following, not running, but walking, its footsteps steady and unhurried, because it knew what I was beginning to suspect. In these woods, there was nowhere to run. The mountains decided when you could leave, and they had not made that decision yet. I don't know how long I ran. The forest blurred around me, trees and rocks and streams all bleeding together. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't dare stop. The steady footsteps behind me never faltered, never hurried, but they never fell behind either. Finally, my foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, sliding down a steep embankment into a small ravine. I lay there, gasping, tasting blood in my mouth from where I'd bitten my tongue. Above me, at the top of the ravine, I could see the figure in black, standing motionless among the trees. It stood there, for what felt like an eternity, that blank space where its face should be pointed in my direction. Then, without a sound, it turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing among the trees, as if it had never been there at all. I stayed in the ravine until my breathing slowed and my heart stopped trying to beat out of my chest. When I finally climbed back up to level ground, my pack was torn and my precious recording equipment was smashed beyond repair. The wax cylinders I'd brought to record the mountain songs were shattered, useless. My water canteen was gone, and my map had been reduced to soggy pulp by a stream I'd apparently crossed in my flight. But I was alive. I had no idea where I was. The sun was beginning to set again. Had I really been running all day? And I needed to find shelter. In the growing darkness, I spotted what looked like a structure through the trees, a cabin perhaps, or a barn. Somewhere with walls and a roof, somewhere I could barricade myself for the night. As I got closer, I saw it was indeed a cabin, but it was abandoned. The roof had partially collapsed, and vines had overtaken the walls. The door hung crooked on one hinge. But it was shelter, and I was desperate. Inside, the cabin was a single room. There had a fireplace, its stones blackened with old soot, a rough wooden table, and a single chair, both covered in a thick layer of dust. In one corner, a bed frame with the remains of a straw mattress, mostly rotted away. I tried to push the door closed, but it wouldn't shut properly. Instead, I dragged the table over to block the doorway. It wouldn't stop anything determined to get in, but it might slow it down. It might give me warning. There was wood stacked beside the fireplace, dry despite the cabin's age and decay. I built a fire, and as the flames caught and grew, I felt some small measure of comfort. Fire was primal protection, wasn't it? What creature, natural or otherwise, didn't fear fire? As the light from the fireplace pushed back the darkness, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The walls of the cabin were covered in writing, not carved like the symbols on the tree but scratched, as if someone had used a knife or a piece of rock to write directly on the wood. The writing was frantic, overlapping, running in all directions. I stepped closer to read it. They won't let me leave the whistlers come at night. God, help me, I've been here for weeks. The dates don't make sense. The man with no face, he just watches. Don't go alone. Don't go alone. Don't go alone. That last phrase was repeated hundreds of times, covering an entire wall, the letters getting larger and more desperate toward the end. In the corner, barely visible in the firelight, I saw something that made my breath catch. Clothing, a pack, a hat, and scattered among them, bones, human bones. Someone had died here. Someone who had also come to these mountains alone and found themselves trapped, just as I was now trapped. How long had they survived in this cabin, writing their warnings on the walls, before they finally succumbed to starvation or madness or whatever horror had finally claimed them? I backed away from the corner, my mind reeling. I had to get out of these mountains. I had to find my way back to civilization. I would leave at first light, follow the sun eastward, and I wouldn't stop until I was clear of these cursed woods. But first, I had to survive the night. As full darkness fell, the sounds began again. The whistling started first, that same pattern, 3 short, 1 long, circling the cabin. Then came the footsteps, dozens of them walking around and around the cabin in an endless procession. They were accompanied by that terrible laughter, rising and falling like a tide. I sat with my back to the fireplace, facing the blocked doorway, clutching a broken piece of wood like a weapon. The fire cast wild shadows on the walls, making the desperate words seem to move and writhe. Something scratched at the door, long, slow scrapes, like fingernails on wood. The table I'd used to block it shifted slightly. Whatever was out there was testing it, seeing if it could get in. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking. "Leave me alone." The scratching stopped. Then a voice answered me, and it was the worst thing yet, because I recognized it. It was my own voice, speaking from just outside the door. "Why should I leave?" it said, perfectly mimicking my tone, my accent, everything. "This is my home now. These are my woods. I belong here." "That's not true, Mike," I said, though I was shaken so hard I could barely get the words out. "I'm leaving at first light. I'm going home." My own voice laughed at me from the darkness. "No one leaves these woods, not when they come alone. The mountains are hungry, and you fed yourself to them when you ignored the warnings." Other voices joined in then, a chorus of them, all speaking at once. Some sounded like the old woman from town. Others were voices I'd never heard, young and old, men and women and children. They all said the same thing, over and over. "Never go alone into the woods. You'll regret it. The mountains are hungry. You belong to us now." I clamped my hands over my ears, but I could still hear them, could still hear that awful chorus. And underneath it all, a sound that made my soul shrink inside me. The sound of many feet entering the cabin, even though I could see the doorway was still blocked. I opened my eyes. They were inside the cabin with me. Dozens of them, standing in the shadows at the edges of the firelight. Some looked almost human, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces pale and expressionless. Others were less human, their forms seeming to shift and change when I looked at them directly. And there, standing in the center of them all, was the figure in black with no face. It reached out one long-fingered hand toward me. I screamed and threw my piece of wood at it. The wood passed through it like it was made of smoke and clattered against the wall. The figure didn't react at all. It simply stood there, hand outstretched, waiting. "What do you want?" I sobbed. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head again in that horrible neck-breaking way. Then it spoke, though it had no mouth, its voice emanating from the air itself, from the walls, from the very trees outside. "You came alone," it said, each word like a nail being driven into my skull. "That makes you ours. The mountains must be fed. They have always been fed. The old families know this. They send us the foolish and the arrogant, and the ones who won't listen, and we take them, and they become part of the wood, part of the stone, part of the mountain itself. As you will be." "No," I whispered. "No, I won't. I'm leaving. "You cannot leave," the figure said. "Not alone. You will wander these woods until you die, and then you will wander them still. One more voice to warn the next fool who comes alone into these mountains." The other figures began to move closer, closing in around me. I could see now that some of them bore injuries, twisted limbs, gaping wounds, bones showing through translucent skin. These were the others who had come before me, All the others who had ignored the warnings and ventured alone into the Appalachian woods. I was about to join them. I must have fainted because when I opened my eyes, it was light. Not the pale gray of pre-dawn, but actual morning sunlight streaming through the gaps in the cabin's collapsed roof. The fire had burned down to cold ashes. The table still blocked the door. And I was alone. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, a fever dream brought on by exhaustion and fear. But then I saw my hands, covered in scratches I didn't remember getting, and my clothes torn and muddy. And on the wall nearest to me, fresh scratches had been added to the desperate warnings. September 28th, 1905, he came for me. I think I'm already dead. I stumbled to my feet, my whole body aching. I had to get out. Now, while it was still light, I pushed the table away from the door and staggered outside. The morning was beautiful, the forest washed clean by a rain I didn't remember hearing. Birds sang in the trees. Everything looked normal, peaceful, innocent. But I knew better now. I started walking, moving, as quickly as my battered body would allow. I had no map, no compass, no supplies. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a desperate will to survive. I walked toward where I thought the sun had risen, hoping it would lead me east, back toward civilization. The whistling started almost immediately, 3 short, 1 long. From every direction, the laughter echoed through the trees, and I could hear them walking beside me, just out of sight, keeping pace. I walked faster. They matched my speed. I ran. They ran with me. I was trapped in a nightmare that would never end, doomed to wander these mountains forever, just as the figure had promised. I would die here, alone, and become one more warning voice for the next fool who ventured into these woods without heeding the old wisdom. Never go alone, never go alone, never go. That's when I heard it. Different from all the other sounds, cutting through the whistling and the laughter and the footsteps. A human voice, a real human voice. Hello? Is someone there? I crashed through the underbrush toward the sound, not caring about the branches that tore at my face and arms. And there, in a small clearing, I saw them. A group of people, real people. 3 men in work clothes, carrying axes and saws. Loggers, I realized, working a timber claim. Please, I gasped, stumbling toward them. Please, you have to help me. I've been lost, and there are things in these woods, things that... The nearest man, a burly fellow with a thick beard, caught me as my legs gave out. Easy there, friend, easy. You look like you've been through hell. The woods, I said, clutching at his shirt. We can't stay here. We have to leave. They're coming. Who's coming? Another man asked, looking around nervously. The whistlers. The ones with no faces. They won't let you leave if you're alone, but there's 4 of us now. We can make it out together. We have to. 4, the bearded man said gently. Friend, there's only 3 of us. I looked around wildly. He was right. 3 men. But I could have sworn... I had been so certain. The whistling started again, very close now. One of the other men went pale. Sam, he said to the bearded man, I don't like this. I think we should go. Agreed, Sam said. He kept a firm grip on my arm. Come on, friend. Our camp's not far. We'll get you some food and water, and then we're all heading down the mountain. This whole area's giving me a bad feeling. They practically carried me through the forest, moving quickly but carefully, always staying together. The whistling followed us, and I heard the laughter too, but the loggers heard it as well now. I could see the fear in their eyes. We moved as a group, and we didn't stop. It took hours, but finally, as the sun was beginning to set, we broke through the tree line onto a log-in road, a real road with wagon ruts and fresh stumps and signs of recent human activity. The sounds from the forest stopped immediately, cut off as cleanly as if someone had closed a door. We kept walking until we reached the loggers' camp, where 4 more men waited. They gave me food and whiskey and a blanket, and I told them everything while we huddled around their fire. Some of them clearly thought I was mad. Others nodded knowingly, exchanging glances. "The old folks say the mountains are alive," one of them finally said. "They say there are places in these woods where the old rules still apply, places that belong to something that was here long before we were. And the first rule is simple: never go alone." "Why?" I asked. "Why does it matter?" "Because one person can disappear, and no one but the mountains will ever know. But 2 or more, they anchor each other to the world of the living. They remember who they are and where they came from. The mountains can't take you so easy when you're not alone." That night, I slept among the loggers, safe in their numbers. In the morning, they guided me down the mountain to the nearest town. Not Hickory Falls, but a different settlement called Cedar Gap. From there, I caught a train east, and I didn't stop until I was back in Philadelphia.